Hello, this web seminar is provided by uscivicstraining.org, George Washington's Farewell Address, Part 6, Debt and Taxes. And we'll take a look now at George Washington's salient points on this topic. First, debt. And we find ourselves in paragraph 30 of George Washington's Farewell Address that he gave on Constitution Day, and here are his sentiments on debt. As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. In other words, don't ruin a nation's credit by having too much debt. Also, he makes the point, having low or no debt is a source of national strength and national security. Boy, this sentence right here is so relevant to the modern conversation that's needing to be had in the United States. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible. In other words, do not make it a practice to use debt or deficit spending. Avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace. He goes on, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it. And so here he's making the point that spending for national defense in advance and having a strong country is more prudent than after conflict ensues when it's more expensive to defend yourself. He goes on about debt by saying this, avoiding likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, and by shunning occasions of expense, what Washington is saying here is don't take on every pet project. The federal government's job is not to look for things to spend money on, but it's to be very cautious and to limit itself to its constitutional purposes in spending money. And so he continues the sentence by saying this, but by vigorous exertions in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned. A couple of observations here. George Washington was a realist enough to know that there would be conflicts with other countries, and so wars and conflicts would be inevitable and would cause debts. But he says here that those debts that might be acquired during military conflicts need to be paid off as soon as possible, and not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. Again, a huge sentence here where Washington is describing the pure immorality of putting our debts on our children, grandchildren, and future generations. Washington would find himself in conflict with most government officials on this point in this day and age, and in society in general, that seems to be spend money now and to place those debts on our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. He says the execution of these maxims belong to your representatives. In other words, the spending at the federal government is a House of Representatives issue. They alone are accountable for the public purse. That's their role constitutionally, and they need to be held accountable. But Washington also observes it is necessary that public opinion should cooperate. In other words, citizens have to care about not incurring debt or pushing debt on future generations, but because if they don't care, then the House of Representatives and the elected officials will not be held accountable. And that's been the case in the United States for literally the last half of century, almost 60 or 70 years at this point, as far as the citizens' corporate concern on the accumulation of public debt. It's not really been existent. So those are Washington's thoughts on debt. Now let's join that with his thoughts on taxes that he picks up in paragraph 30. To facilitate to them the performance of their duty, it's essential that you should practically bear in mind that towards the payment of debts there must be revenue, that to have revenue there must be taxes, and that no taxes can be devised which are not more or less inconvenient and unpleasant. And so he's saying here in this paragraph that both to run the national government within its constitutional limits, there'll need to be some kind of revenue stream, and also to service debts, they'll need a source of revenue. Now here comes a really interesting sentence from Washington. That the intrinsic embarrassment inseparable from the selection of proper objects, which is always a choice of difficulties. What's Washington saying here? Well, he's basically saying it's embarrassing to choose what to tax. at that time there was no federal income tax that taxed workers on their earnings, and so during that period they had to choose what product, service, import or export they were going to tax. And so he's saying there it's kind of embarrassing to even have that conversation, because by taxing something we're going to influence a certain group of people's livelihood. And so this whole process of taxes is a necessary evil of having government. Taxing is not a good thing. But he goes on to say it ought to be a decisive motive for a candid construction. And so he's saying, all right, so it's embarrassing to have the conversation, but since we're going to have it, it gives us a reason for talking about it so that it's out in the open. He goes on. What is also out in the open is the conduct of the government in making it. And what he's saying by this additional part of the sentence is the government ought to give exceptionally clear reasons for the tax, how it would work, and how it would be managed. And so these are just key observations of government transparency and an inkling of leaders that they should not look just to spend money that is in the federal coffers, but be really cautious and within constitutional limits to do so. Lastly, Washington concludes this section with the citizen's role, and he says this: "And for a spirit of acquiescence in the measures for obtaining revenue, which the public exigencies, that is, the pressing needs, may at any time dictate." He basically is saying this, that for citizens, if the government is honest, clear, and staying within its constitutional bounds in its responsibilities and not putting a debt burden on future generations, the citizens should assent or agree to the tax without protest. And so these are George Washington's sentiments on debt, taxes, and the citizen's role. I think Washington has a lot to say to all of us in this day. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.